Metal screeched against metal. Her limbs pulled tighter, tighter, until the awful crack of breaking bones echoed through the dark, damp chambers of the Tower of London. She was just 25. Her name was Anne Askew, and her arms and legs had just been destroyed by the rack, Tudor England's most terrifying instrument of torture. But Anne's story didn't end there. 4 months later, on July 16, 1546, she was carried, unable to walk, to a bonfire in Smithfield. Her body had been so mangled by torture that she could no longer stand. Her crime? Refusing to deny her religious beliefs in a time when your faith could get you killed. To understand Anne's horrifying fate, we have to step back into the dangerous and chaotic religious world of 16th century England. By the time Anne was born in 1521, King Henry VIII had already broken ties with the Catholic Church in Rome. He'd declared himself the head of the newly formed Church of England. But that didn't bring peace. The country became a battleground between conservative Catholics and radical Protestants. And the king? He shifted his alliances based on whatever suited his political agenda that week. Into this uncertain world came Anne Askew, born to a minor noble family in Lincolnshire. From early on, it was clear she was no ordinary girl. While most women were discouraged from even opening a Bible, Anne devoured scripture and theological writings. Her family was impressed at first, proud even. But that pride didn't last. Anne didn't just read scripture, she questioned it. She challenged transubstantiation, the Catholic belief that the bread and wine used in Mass literally become the body and blood of Christ. Anne believed it was symbolic, nothing more. In Henry's England, that belief was heresy. At just 15, Anne was forced into marriage with Thomas Kyme, a devout Catholic. The marriage was supposed to tame her, to turn her away from her dangerous ideas. It failed. Anne left her husband and her children, an unthinkable scandal at the time, and moved to London. There she connected with radical Protestant circles and began preaching. Openly, boldly, publicly challenging both religious and social rules. A woman speaking about faith? That alone was enough to stir outrage. Anne's actions escalated. She distributed banned Protestant writings. She criticized Catholic practices. And in 1545, the inevitable happened. She was arrested and charged with heresy. During her interrogation, Anne stunned her accusers. She spoke with the clarity and depth of a trained theologian. Even her inquisitors couldn't deny her intelligence. But that only made things worse. A smart woman, unafraid, and preaching heresy? That was twice as threatening. She was released after weeks in prison. But Anne didn't back down. She kept preaching, kept writing, and her following grew, London's merchants and artisans drawn to her courage and clarity. In one letter she wrote, "I would rather die than live denying Christ." Those words, written not long before her death, would turn out to be chillingly prophetic. Anne had made powerful enemies, chief among them, Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, a man determined to stamp out Protestant influence. He viewed Anne as a clear and present danger, and he was determined to silence her for good. In 1546, Anne was arrested again. This time, the charge was denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. It was a death sentence. They weren't interested in mercy. They wanted to break her. Anne was taken to the Tower of London. There, she was introduced to the rack. This horrific device consisted of a wooden frame, ropes, and pulleys. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied and then slowly stretched until joints dislocated and bones snapped. It was rare for a woman to face the rack, but Anne was not treated with leniency. On June 29, 1546, Anne was led into the cold, wet chambers beneath the tower. Waiting there were Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Richard Rich, two men whose names would go down in history as symbols of cruelty. Anne was stripped, her limbs bound. At first they applied gentle pressure, hoping she'd crack under the fear. But Anne didn't break. She prayed, quietly, calmly, that only made them angrier. Wriothesley and Rich ordered the executioner to increase the tension. Ropes tightened, her body stretched, then crack. Her arms, her legs shattered, yet still she refused to recant. Even the executioner couldn't continue. He stepped back in pity. And so, in an act of terrifying cruelty, Wriothesley and Rich operated the rack themselves. They pulled until her joints were destroyed, until her limbs were useless, until she had to be carried, limp and broken, back to her cell. Many thought she'd die before trial, but Anne survived. Barely. In the weeks that followed, Anne could not walk. She could barely write, but she never gave in. Instead, she dictated letters to friends and supporters, letters that would become famous for their courage and clarity. Despite her agony, Anne held firm in her faith. In one of those letters, she described her pain but declared that God had given her strength. Her hands were barely functional, but her spirit was unbroken. The trial was a joke. She was carried into court in a chair. Still, she spoke clearly, boldly, unshaken. She defended her right to interpret Scripture. She denied transubstantiation once again. It didn't matter. The verdict was already written: death by fire at Smithfield. And so, on July 16, 1546, Anne Askew was brought to her execution. The morning of July 16, 1546, dawned clear over London. A large crowd began gathering at Smithfield, an open space long associated with executions. That day, the city was buzzing with whispers. Everyone had heard of Anne Askew. Everyone knew what had been done to her. 4 people were to die that day: John Lascelles, John Adams, Nicholas Belenian, and Anne Askew. But it was Anne's name that drew the crowds. It was Anne's face, pale, hollow-eyed, and calm, that held their attention. She was carried to the stake. Carried because she could no longer walk. Her shattered limbs made any movement impossible. She was placed gently into a chair and tied upright with chains to the central stake. Her tunic hung loosely over her broken body. What happened next stunned those present. Even in that moment, on the edge of death, Anne's voice rose in prayer. According to Protestant witnesses who would later write down their memories, she remained composed, her words filled with conviction. Her faith was unshaken. The crowd went silent. Even the murmurs stopped. Flames were lit, and slowly they rose. Anne could not escape the agony. Her broken body had no way to recoil or shift away. Witnesses said she never screamed, that her lips moved in prayer until the very end, that the fire consumed her, but never crushed her will. She died with dignity, with grace, and with a quiet strength that haunted those who watched. That execution would become one of the most remembered and most horrifying events of the Tudor era. Anne Askew's death sent shockwaves across Europe. Even in a time when public executions were common, the image of a broken young woman burned alive for her beliefs was too much for many to bear. Her letters, smuggled out of the tower by sympathizers, began circulating in secret. Protestants across England and the continent passed them hand to hand. In those letters, she spoke not just of pain, but of peace, of hope, of her belief that her suffering was not in vain. One line in particular became famous: "My body may be broken, but my soul remains intact before God." She had written it with trembling, nearly paralyzed hands. Yet those words traveled farther than her voice ever could. They touched readers in Germany, France, the Netherlands, wherever the Protestant Reformation had taken hold. In England, the impact was felt even within the royal court. Many had supported Henry VIII's break with Rome, but Anne's death revealed just how brutal the enforcement of doctrine had become. Even some allies of the king were disturbed. Anne had been noble-born, intelligent, articulate. If she could be tortured until her limbs were destroyed, then who was truly safe? The aristocracy took notice. So did moderate reformers. One of them was Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. A secret Protestant sympathizer herself, she must have seen in Anne a mirror, a warning of what might happen if she spoke too freely. Historians believe Anne's death served as a chilling message to women like Catherine. Keep your faith silent, or risk the flames. The image of Anne Askew chained to the stake became legend. Later, Protestant chroniclers would recount her execution in vivid detail. Some said that as the fire climbed higher, her voice could still be heard, faint but clear, reciting Bible verses. Some in the crowd reportedly wept. Others stared, frozen in disbelief. Even hardened executioners, men used to watching people die, were said to have been shaken. The same man who had earlier refused to continue torturing her on the rack would later describe her strength as supernatural. Over time, her legacy grew. When Elizabeth the Thorse, daughter of Anne Boleyn, came to the throne decades later, she restored Protestantism in England. And with that restoration came a new view of Anne Askew. She was no longer a condemned heretic. She was a martyr, a symbol, a pioneer. Her theological writings, once banned, were studied in Protestant seminaries. Her letters were republished and read aloud in secret gatherings. Reformers across Europe spoke her name with reverence. Anne hadn't just died for her faith. She had died for the right to question, to speak, to believe in something bigger than a king or a bishop. Anne's story isn't just one of suffering, it's one of defiance. She refused to be silenced by power, by pain, or by fear. She stood firm in her beliefs when the safest thing she could have done was stay quiet. She defied not just the religious authorities of her day, but the societal expectations that demanded women stay silent and obedient. She walked away from a forced marriage. She preached publicly in the streets of London. She faced the rack with scripture on her lips, and she met the flames with unshakable conviction. More than 400 years later, Anne Askew remains one of the most powerful examples of courage under tyranny. A symbol of religious freedom, a voice for women in theology. A reminder that sometimes the softest voices echo the loudest through history. Her death was brutal, but her legacy, unbreakable. Though her body was reduced to ashes, Anne Askew's story refused to die. Her name became a rallying cry for religious reformers throughout Europe. Her writings were recopied and smuggled into cities and villages where Protestant beliefs were growing in strength. For many, her life and her death embodied what it meant to stand for truth in a world ruled by fear. The church had tried to erase her, but her letters, her courage, and the haunting memory of her final moments ensured she would never be forgotten. Even the very tool used to break her, the rack, took on new meaning. No longer just a symbol of punishment, it became a warning to those in power. You can shatter bones, but you cannot silence faith. In the decades following her execution, reformers across the continent invoked Anne's name in their own battles for religious freedom. In sermons, pamphlets, and letters, she was described not just as a martyr, but as a warrior, someone who had fought tyranny with nothing but her words and her unwavering belief in God. Anne Askew wasn't just remarkable for her faith. She was extraordinary for her intellect, her independence, and her refusal to conform to the roles assigned to her. In an age when women were expected to remain silent, she spoke. When told to submit, she resisted. When offered safety in exchange for silence, she chose suffering. That defiance went far beyond religion. It was revolutionary. By standing in front of judges, clergy, and executioners, and calmly, boldly defending her beliefs, Anne shattered the illusion that women had no place in theological debate. She proved that intelligence, conviction, and spiritual insight weren't confined to male scholars in universities or cathedrals. She proved that a woman's voice, once raised, could shake kingdoms. Even today, scholars and activists look back at Anne Askew as a forerunner of both religious liberty and women's rights. Her writings, preserved against all odds, are studied not just for their theology, but for their strength, clarity, and moral courage. She showed that the human spirit, when rooted in conviction, can rise above the most brutal oppression. There's a reason Anne's story still resonates, because it reminds us of the dangerous power of conviction, the kind of belief that can't be bought, bullied, or broken. In every era, regimes rise that demand silence, obedience, and conformity. And in every era, there are those who refuse. Anne was one of them. She didn't lead an army. She didn't hold political office. She didn't write volumes of reformist doctrine. What she did was far more dangerous. She told the truth as she saw it, and she refused to recant. That truth was enough to terrify bishops, to mobilize inquisitors, to bring a young woman to the rack, and then the flames. But in the end, they couldn't defeat her. Not really. Because the power that tried to break her, the machinery of state and church, faded. But Anne's words, her faith, and her name lived on. Today, Anne Askew's story is preserved not just in historical archives, but in churches, books, and hearts. Her name appears in martyrologies and stained glass. Her courage is honored by both scholars and believers. She stands as a symbol of spiritual resistance, of dignity in the face of horror. And though she lived in a time when asking the wrong question could mean death, she asked it anyway. And we remember her not for how she died, but for how she lived, for what she refused to surrender, for the truth she held close, even when it cost her everything. Anne Askew wasn't supposed to be remembered. She was supposed to be erased. But instead, she became immortal.